Hi guys. I'm going to get a 1-minute jump start because we have 5 panelists in 30 or 60 minutes. So they're each going to do a quick presentation, 10 minutes each on a more of a demo basis. Just as a little background, this session was, can you hear me? Okay, this session was born out of the fact that I've been coming to MCN or other museum conferences for a really long time, and I feel like the majority, if not all, of the digital asset management sessions all revolve around the collection and putting your collection online and what do you do with your collection and collection and collection. I feel at this point everybody knows how to manage their collection in digital assets by the back, like the back of their hand. I'm like, what about everything else? Because that's the big mystery, I feel. Like, what do you do with your marketing files? What do you do with your education files? What do you do with your design files? What do you do with, like, literally everything that is not related to your collection that doesn't have metadata already? So that was the discussion around the birth of this session. So I'm going to just skip over anything else and get into this quickly because we do, like I said, have 5 people to come up and do their quick demos. First is Michael Campos-Quinn. He is the Metadata and Digital Asset Manager at the UC Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. Michael has a BA in Film Studies and a MLIS, and has a background in film archives. His current role encompasses everything from cataloging unique film prints and legacy video formats to tinkering with digital asset management tools.
Okay, hello. One thing that was also part of our conversation in setting this up was that, sure, sorry. Okay, can you hear me? Hello, everyone. So one part of the conversation was that we were going to talk about things that are not perfect. So you'll see a lot of things in my presentation anyway that are not perfect. So, okay, and then also the title is non-collection. You got to say, damn, Bamfa. All right. So as Heidi mentioned, dealing with your collection, excuse me, let me get my notes up, excuse me. So we have a nice fellowship of our open source CMS, which is collection space, Piction. We use Drupal for our main website, and all of this works really well together to push our art collection into really nice, neat packages that go online in different places, including our website, including our art collection portal. We push our assets and our metadata to the California Digital Library, which is available on Calisphere, and it's collated with all kinds of other stuff from California archives and libraries. It works together really, really nicely. But again, this is about the things that are not so much in Middle Earth, but are in the real world. And so this includes things like, what do we do with our one-off documentation images that go onto our social media sites? We do a lot of video that goes onto YouTube. But there's sometimes been a bit of a gap in how we treat these assets and how we'd like to treat them. Okay, and so with things like event documentation, and I'll go into the kinds of assets that I'm talking about in a second, the real question is, how do we rule them all? And Piction is what we use for our digital asset management system. And like I said, it works really well for our collection. It's mostly for our non-AV assets, but there's a real tension between me, the librarian, who wants metadata and standards-based work done really carefully, and the rest of my colleagues at BAM PFA, who are mostly concerned with their deadlines no one has enough time to deal with this kind of thing because of limited staffing. And so as an overview of the kinds of things that we have that are our non-collection assets, we have event documentation, which includes AV, still images, and these come from all kinds of sources. So these are user-submitted things that come on off of Instagram that we capture. We have contract photographers. We have student employees who we send off into the galleries to document things like this performance, which was an analog light show festival, which is pretty cool. Occasionally we have staff who are responsible for this, creating these assets. A lot of times we have no one. So it's not, the production of these assets is also not a tightly controlled mechanism. And then of course we have program documentation, so photographs of school tours, lectures, special programming, like we have an art lab where we take a lot of photos of people making things in our galleries. We have a large collection of film stills, so we have about 100,000 print stills that we digitize on occasion, but we also get quite a few stills that are born digital from film distributors in the process of promoting our film programs. We also have gallery installation shots, so it includes things like gallery shots and also performance documentation like this one that you see here. Again, it's a little bit more tightly controlled than our event documentation, and that we have for-hire photographers document these works, but we also have students occasionally come and walk through the galleries and take snapshots with their iPhones. And then, of course, we have lots of marketing materials. There are things like headshots for people who are coming to speak at the institution, things like Roller Girl. I think there's a reading club that is going to be using this. I'm not really sure where it came from, but it's something that's pretty typical of the kinds of materials. Thank you. Yeah, so it's typical of the kinds of material that are used for promoting special events. We also have digitized films. These are in-house scans. These are things that come in as part of preservation projects in collaboration with other institutions. And we also acquire some films digitally, and these come in as DCPs on a hard drive. And as I said, Piction is our digital asset management system, and it works really well for our art collection. But part of our implementation faced a lot of roadblocks from staff buy-in, and a lot of it had to do with our interface. We had a lot of staff who just refused to use Piction, actually, which was challenging. And as a result of our communications staff who had a difficult time using Piction, let's see, excuse me. I'll just skip over a couple of things. I've done a few workarounds in cooperation with a couple of other staff members, like a web designer, to implement something like this, which is a drive to Piction funnel. So in early 2017, we hired a new communications director who was not willing to say, you must use Piction, but she was willing to say, let's use Drive, and she did facilitate the streamlining of the gathering of assets for our program guide and for our website. And so you can see here that the top three folders are, well, maybe you can't see it because it's a really terrible image. Anyway, so we have an FTP structure in Piction that corresponds to events, exhibition, and film-related images. And I convinced the communications director to structure the Google Drive folders along those lines. And there's a set of scripts that use a synced Google Drive folder that's a local copy of what they use for their production environment. And I had an opportunity to be kind of a gatekeeper of these assets that come into Drive using a bunch of regular expressions that you can kind of see some squiggles on the screen here. That's trying to conform what they produce with our file naming guidelines. Thank you. And so based on this, these scripts FTP files from the local copy of drive, the drive folder structure, into Piction, which is cool because it means that we have our assets at least contained in Piction, which was not happening before. But also, it means that there's a lot of error logging that happens, and there's no one really to do cleanup. It means that I sometimes have to chase down people to say, rename these files and try again, or just do it myself. The other problem is that there's no metadata involved in this process. So images are just sort of being shifted into Piction wholesale without anything like the dates people pictured, all that sort of metadata that's really useful for people using these images after the deadline has passed. And you can take a look. You can't really see this here, but I'm just like scrolling through all the fields that we have in Piction, and yeah, there's a lot of them. So no one's going to do this. So another option that has come up recently is a web app where people can choose files and enter metadata in a really friendly and modern interface. And this is just a local thing, and it's contained on our 1 minute? Okay, cool. Yeah, so it works. It's cool. It's pretty. People are like interested, and like I said, part of the implementation problem that we had with Piction was the interface, and so maybe this is something that we can use to help people sort of shift in the right direction. And in terms of our AV assets, there are also a couple of options that are coming in as well. So we use Phoenix, which is a proprietary system, as well as a few open source options that we're looking at right now. That's it.
We're going to do questions at the end just so that we can get through all of 5 people that are up here. Next up is Richard Urban. He is the digital asset manager and strategist at the Corning Museum of Glass. Richard has a background in the development of cultural heritage metadata and digitization best practices across libraries, archives, and museums. At CMOG, he is responsible for managing the organization's migration to a new digital asset management system. Richard holds an MA in history and museum studies, as well as an MLIS and PhD in library and information science.
Good morning, everyone. So nice to see everyone show up so early. I assume this is all the people who didn't go to karaoke last night. One of the other sort of motivating factors behind this panel was, if you were at the session I did yesterday, we sort of did the big overview of like how we're moving from MediaBin to Piction, and there's never enough time to really get into the details. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one aspect of what we're doing in that migration, which is actually all the things that are not in MediaBin. Somewhere around 2015, our marketing communications department was feeling that MediaBin wasn't meeting their needs very well. And also we had already gone out and started our RFP process. So they knew something new was coming. So they decided they were just going to stop using MediaBin. So now there's a folder on a shared network drive that actually our IT manager is in the back. Hi, Randy. That's called Pictures from MediaBin, in which they've just basically been putting things that they hope eventually to load into some digital asset management system. And it includes just this big long file structure. And then as you go down multiple layers of into this, you end up at basically a pile of files that some camera somewhere just named with an ordinal. And right, Don't Try This at Home is actually a program that we do about the properties of glass. So if you ever come to the museum, it's a great program to come to. But also, right, don't try this at home. So partly coming into the organization, one of the other things is there's also been a lot of staff turnover in the department. So some of the people who started this are no longer there. So we're trying to figure out like, well, what actually is all in here and what do we need to do in order to get it ready to go into Piction? So first of all, and some of this may seem a little bit rudimentary, but also if you're a museum who who does not have a dam and all you have is a pile of files and you're thinking about how to get ready, about how to write your RFP, how much stuff do you actually have, some of this may be able to help you. So there's some basic command line things that you can do to basically output a list of all the files in a folder or directory to a text file. And these are the window and things. There's also a little program called Karen's Directory Printer that runs on Windows that you can install that will do this sort of same thing, but through kind of a GUI interface. So great, now I have a list of everything and what folders and what folders it's in. There are some other switches on these commands where if you want like a date stamp or the file size, you can do that as well, but these are just sort of the basic starting points. How many of you are familiar with something called Open Refine? Oh, good. Right, so basically I'm taking that text file into Open Refine so I can parse out the directory structure and file name. Again, the metadata for these files is really in that folder structure. The file name itself is just, again, that camera-based file name. So being able to take that raw text in and parse it out. In some cases, there are file names that are meaningful, so I can also kind of deal with some of those. And so this is just some basic stuff. If you're unfamiliar with Open Refine, it is a tool that is intended for doing some of this kind of data science stuff. It works, it's kind of like Excel on steroids. And if you're also someone who is a little bit of a programmer and understands things like regular expressions, and Michael was just talking about, there's a whole set of string and manipulation functions that you can use regular expressions. One of the problems is occasionally things like accession numbers show up in our file names. That if you, I'll talk a little bit next about how I'm using Tableau to then visualize some of this, and it has a simple like split columns based on a character. Well, I've got periods all the way through file names, directory names, all the way up. So I need something a little bit more powerful than just splitting on a thing, so I can write regular expressions to get around some of those file name anomalies. Right, so then I can break this down into some nice columns and start using this data in different ways to think about how I want to visualize this data. Again, part of this might be rudimentary to some of us who are used to working at the command line or working with file systems. This is in part a process about how do I communicate with my stakeholders about what they actually have so we can have a conversation about making decisions about some of it. And that's why I'm then moving stuff into Tableau. I mean, people know about Tableau. It is a data visualization tool, and it makes taking tabular data and creating different kinds of visualizations much easier. I mean, you can do some of this with charts in Excel, but Tableau is also very interactive, so you can kind of play with it. The same thing with Open Refine is some of that stuff you could also do in Excel, but there are lots of things I can do in Refine that I can just kind of do dynamically and kind of do data exploration. So that's why these two tools have been working really well for me. So this is sort of just sort of taking those and counting how many files are in different directories to get a sense of what's big. Of course, any part of using data visualization is trying to figure out what the story is that you're trying to tell. So these are a couple of sets of visualizations where I'm trying to look at what kinds of files are actually in all of these directories. Partly the way we're moving to Piction, one of the things that Piction has is a loader. The loader sort of is kind of dependent on certain file types. So is it a JPEG or is it a movie? So I'm trying to figure out what's even in there. And so, right, the first pass at this is, wow, we've got lots of little JPEGs and a bunch of big movies. But I don't know how interesting, I like the kind of moire pattern that this creates, but I don't know how good this tells a story to my stakeholders about what it is that they have. So then I switched it to looking at like average file size. And I don't know, this is also a little bit unsatisfying because, right, movies are big, JPEGs are small. But then I can also look and sort of see what's the distribution of size of JPEGs, and you can see that most of them fall into sort of a range. But then there's this like one that's like 100 and something megs, so it's like, okay, well, what's that file? And that's also interesting to look at those outliers and then try to sort of sort through, like, well, are there some special cases that we need to accommodate as we're planning the migration? The other thing that I've been doing is then taking all of this and wrapping it up into a nice kind of Word document that I can then hand to our marketing folks and say, here's what's in there. Let's have a conversation about it. Do you really need those TrueType font files that I found through this inventory? to go into Piction, or can we get rid of those? Or what are these other weird things? Do we need to convert some smaller sets of file types that were sort of hidden in that pile that we might not have noticed before? And then also, some of the things you can do if you turn that switch on with the date stamp, you can then make a nice graph like this, like, oh, well, when were these things created? Part of this has now prompted a conversation about our records retention policy. And particularly, like, there's some of that stuff in that long tail that's in that graph are things that are outside the current official retention policy. So now maybe let's think about handling those things differently. Maybe some of that stuff is going to go actually to the institutional archives. We're going to give it to the librarians to take care of, in part because marketing doesn't really want to have to deal with them anymore. So through this process, we've started this other kind of conversation about what are these assets and how is it that we should manage them and how should they get moved into Piction. Now I'm very curious about Michael's file naming script because, the other way we're dealing with some of this is we're actually looking at training some of those staff and using Adobe Bridge, in part because it's got some batch file naming processes that we can use to bring some of those files into compliance with some file naming schemes that were around, but haven't really been applied recently. And also we're developing an internal controlled vocabulary that we can use as a tab-separated file in the keywords field that we can then use to build categories in Piction to make some of the navigation a little bit easier. And that's going pretty well. They've actually been pretty receptive to that because they're also a little bit frustrated with this big pile of files because then they can never find anything. And hopefully we can solve that with some easy things that they can do. And that's it. Thanks. Who's next?
Next up is Jessica Herzig-Knesny. Knesny, I was close. Sorry. Jessica has her MA in Public History after several years of working in archives, collections management as a curatorial assistant. Jessica started working with digital collections and rights management during her time at the Chicago History Museum. Since 2014, Jessica has been the digital asset manager at the Detroit Institute of Arts.
Good morning. All right, so I was hired on to implement the inaugural digital asset management system, Piction. And like everyone else, we started with images of our collection. So we have a mostly working bidirectional integration with TMS. And this includes images from our photography department, collections management, and registrars. So it really varies widely in quality of the images. And as when I started going around to everyone in the museum. What do you do? How can I help? Because I knew we were going to move beyond collections. So it's been kind of a 3-year process to get buy-in from the executive level, and we have it tied to our strategic plan. And so really leveraging those personal connections, because digital metadata, words like that have been really scary for a lot of people at the institution. And then we've also worked to broaden the definition of collections. You know, when I started, it was very focused, you're focused on the art. So let's talk about institutional archives, marketing, everything. And then so really with the objective of having preservation of not just the assets, but also the information about the assets. So first steps I really look at as a rescue mission, going around what are our high risk, at-risk assets that are just stored on, Everett's hard drive. And he's the only one that has access to these. So moving those to become part of the storage and backup plan, and developing plans for appraisal and metadata entry. And that's where our records retention and deletion policies that our research library has set up, those have been invaluable because she had already been looking at digital assets as part of these policies. So let's really start following these policies. So right now I'm working on non-collections image archive, the architectural drawings for the institution, not our collection, are all on CDs, so it takes building ops forever to find what they need, getting those in a safe place. Conservation images, interpretive labels, and right now we're revising our digital preservation policy, and we have created a metadata standards committee. So the first thing that we focused on are our interpretive labels that go back about 2002. And I don't know how many times, actually I should have counted how many times people came up to me and said, we go down to the gallery to take a photo of the label, So it's registrars, interpretive staff, education, curators. So we really, and there again, it's just on one person's workstation, and that's not tenable. So we developed the use case scenarios, outlined the scope of the project. We started with permanent galleries, so we're really leveraging TMS, creating exhibitions in the exhibition module, adding the objects, and then we defined and tested the workflows, and I really want to give a shout out to our TMS manager, Christina Gibbs. I have her email up there. She created these next two slides, actually. So these are our workflows. Right now, we just have all of we're using just the PDFs. The InDesign files are they're saved for 2 years, but we're just saving the PDFs. And we're also putting the text into a text entry so that it's searchable within TMS. So we're just doing, gallery at a time, minimal metadata, and then here's so we have object labels, tombstones, and then the gallery labels and section labels are attached to the exhibition. And then she created a report so that you could export out the actual label text if you didn't want to just use the PDF. And then our next steps is what other metadata that we want. And then we're going to need to rename the files. Everything there used to be a FileMaker database that spit out a code, and so all of the files just have that code with, OL for object label. That's it, no accession number or anything. And then we also need to figure out how to handle rotation. Oh, what did I do?
Oh, sorry, hot corners.
But anyway, we need to figure out what to do with past rotations and future. We want future rotations. Yeah, thank you. And then because just in TMS, that gets really complicated how to organize those exhibitions. And then also we need to look at our workflows for anything new, new file names, new what other tools, because right now it's like InDesign into Word to PDF, so what can we do better moving forward? So we're in talks with our exhibition department about that. So thanks.
It was. That was
Oh,
good.
no, did I go too fast?
No, it's
That's okay.
all good. Next up, Rebecca Weisberg is the digital asset manager at the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. She has a MLIS and a background in archives in the rare book trade and started working in digital asset management at 20th Century Fox.
At SFMOMA, our dams contains about 300,000 assets. The vast majority, about 88%, are collection related, but the proportions vary dramatically by the type of asset, as you can see in these super exciting pie charts. Can you tell I just figured out how to make these? They're going into everything. So about 83% of our assets are images, only 4 and 5% respectively are videos or audio files. But the images are much more likely to be collection related, whereas the AV assets tend to have the metadata needs that aren't addressed by our collection management system. So our metadata schema was developed with an eye towards addressing all types of assets, but it was geared primarily towards the collection images since that was the bulk of the content. We always knew it would evolve as we introduced the rest of the assets, but oops, sorry. So I'm here to talk about that process. So what's the problem? The dams didn't have the metadata capability that users wanted to tag the non-collection related AV content, so they were reluctant to upload and tag the assets at all. Most of them weren't in the dams, they were in silos around the museum, held by different departments. They were stored on shared drives. The metadata was collected and stored in a number of different places. The few that had actually been uploaded to the dams had almost no metadata. You can see one in the middle. This is the sum total of all of the metadata we had for a video file in the dams. It was the department, the date, the file name, and then a code that tied back to another database that I think 2 people in the museum actually had access to. So none of the assets were searchable or reusable unless someone happened to know that they exist and happened to know who to go to get it. And the departments who had the content weren't, hoarding it. They're not Gollum. They really wanted to make it available to the rest of the museum, but they just didn't feel confident in the dams yet. So they were keen to work with the dam team and the vendor to make that happen. So what are these assets? One that I'm going to use as an example throughout is an audio file of a 2012 panel discussion called Unidentified Influences, Artists on Cindy Sherman, hosted by SFMOMA's Public Programs in the Phyllis Wattis Theater. So this is part of a stash of audio files held by our interpretive media department, artist interviews dating back to the 50s. The analog materials had been digitized a few years ago, and since then had been stored along with the born digital assets on shared network drives. Their metadata was tracked in the FileMaker database that, again, their department was the only one that had access to. Another department that played a key role in the project was content strategy and digital engagement. They make all kinds of really great video content, so they're actively creating new things as well as holding on to a backlog of older stuff. They were using Wufoo forms to collect metadata that they were storing, and then again, their files were on the shared network drive. So what did they want? The goal was to be able to clearly track a complex web of relationships using a controlled vocabulary and linked data. This included a number of different relationships between assets and people, places, and things, as well as relationships between assets themselves. They were particularly interested in linking data to external resources via URIs. So the museum team worked with the dam vendor, which is NetX, to identify the needs and document the user stories. They went through 2 rounds of proposals and feedback until both sides felt that they had a common understanding of the requirements. And then we were kind of in a holding pattern while NetX worked to develop the new functionality. So the solution they came to was semantic metadata. There are probably a lot of people, even in this room, who can define this better than I can. So I'm just going to go with this description that I pulled from marklogic.com in case anyone does need it. Semantic data models information in a simple format called RDF triples, Resource Description Framework. An RDF triple is a subject, predicate, and object, such as John lives in London. This simple fact can be combined with another triple, such as London is in England, and a new fact can be inferred, John lives in England, which was not in the original data set. By storing hundreds of billions of triples, you have a sophisticated graph structure through which you can see and discover new information. The triplet components can consist of URIs, Uniform Resource Identifiers, which identify the name and location of resources in a uniform format. So here on the right, you can see the triples that are formed around the asset that we just looked at. So for the Unidentified Influences panel, Artists on Cindy Sherman is the subject, that's the first triple, and then we have Lynn Hirschman-Leeson and Desiree Holman, among others, as speakers. So it breaks down nicely into those triples. So everything I've described so far took place before I joined the museum. Shortly after I came on board, NetX finished and delivered the new functionality, which they called semantic attributes. So with this functionality, we got the ability to define our own semantic objects and organize them into logical types. So here on the left, you can see we have Cindy Sherman defined as a subject. We got a new type of metadata field called a semantic attribute that allowed for controlled repeatable data with a type ahead functionality for easy tagging. and the ability to add URIs. So you can see her on the left. We have one that ties to the Getty's Union list of artist names for Cindy Sherman, which you can see on the right. All right, so now what's the problem? The new functionality was great. It's easy to use and implement from both an admin and a user perspective. But as everyone here knows, there are always going to be issues with adopting, being the first to adopt new technology. So there's always going to be some bugs. Also, because it's the first iteration of the feature, it's not yet totally fleshed out. So with the current structure, we were kind of forced to choose between a lack of control when tagging or duplicate values in the system. So on the top right, you're seeing an example. So we have Lynn Hirschman-Leeson as a speaker in that Cindy Sherman asset, but for other assets, she also needs to be tagged as a subject. So we actually have her in here twice. Ideally, of course, we would want just one entry for her, and then we'd have a little more flexibility in associating object types to attributes. So we know that when that does become available, we will have a bit of a cleanup project on our hands to streamline what's in the system. So like Michael said, it's not perfect, but it's here. And then another issue is that there's not yet a way to bulk import semantic objects, so that led to a couple very tedious afternoons copying and pasting names from a spreadsheet. And then finally, disconnection. So there is a place for URIs, but they don't actually do anything yet. They're just kind of a placeholder. The vendor wanted a little more information on, real world examples of how people would want them to function. So right now they're there, but they're not actually doing anything. So once we had learned how to implement the new attributes, the next step was to meet with all users who held all these asset backlogs and figure out how to merge 3 distinct metadata schemas, the one already in the DAMs plus the one used by each department, into one cohesive set that also fit into the mold provided by the vendor. So existing fields in the 3 different systems pulled from PB Core, Dublin Core, other standards. A lot of them, of course, fit no standard at all. So it was challenging to not only get 3 groups of people to agree, but also make sure that what we decided on would, work for the older assets that had very limited metadata, and also provide a good foundation for, current and future assets that we had a lot more information on. So on the left, you can see 9 different fields that, came from the 3 different systems that all overlapped, even without seeing the values. You can tell by the names, it's a nightmare. So we were ultimately able to condense those 9 fields into 4 on the right. So this also encompassed reconciling the many different types of relationships that the 3 different systems were tracking around all the different roles that people and groups held in the creation of the assets. So, one user was putting like a department name where another was putting a specific person. One group called something production department, which was exactly the same as another group called source department. So after a lot of back and forth, we were able to get 17 fields down to 11. So as with any project, we ran into a few hiccups that, of course, made it take a lot longer than we expected. The first issue was that the new feature, semantic attributes, didn't actually work with the version of the UI we were using, so we had to press pause, upgrade our entire system, retrain our entire staff. Immediately before we began to import the assets, we realized we were running out of storage. The type we had couldn't be expanded, so we had to put the whole project on hold again while we migrated to a new type of repository. And then finally, the stakeholder who held the interpretive media assets and was basically the only one in the museum that knew anything about them, ended up leaving for another opportunity. So we had to suddenly fast track the timeline, kind of drop everything else, work really closely with him to get all of the data and make sure that we knew what it was so that we'd be able to reformat it and get it into the system. Fortunately, he helped make that a priority, so it worked out. So where we are now. So here is that Cindy Sherman asset. It's happily living in the DAMs. It's got all of its metadata. We've finished uploading the first 2 batches of assets, which is the whole interpretive media backlog. We're about to start doing the same with the CSDE department, the other group I mentioned. So there's definitely still a lot of work to be done, but we've finally gotten to the point where it's workable and the users are actually confident enough in the DAMs and in the metadata capabilities that they're willing to turn these things over to us. So now, we finally have this content in the system and available for everyone to find and reuse. So that's it.
And our last presentation is Jennifer Sellar. She is the Digital Asset Management Coordinator at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. Jennifer holds a BA in History and MLIS in Library and Information Science. She oversees all front-end DAM operations, working across various departments throughout the museum to create and manage their digital assets and workflows. She is also the co-chair of MCN's DAMS SIG.
I'm glad. Can you guys hear me? I told you the thing. So I am a little embarrassed by my title now that I look at it, but it may not be sexy or exciting, but it works. So I look at when I start doing projects now with our materials, I try to. Oh, sorry. Okay. Is that good? Okay. Okay. It's weird for me. Okay. Anyway, I try to look at what we're using and utilize that versus trying to think outside the box. So the idea is that we looked at, you can see here's a piece of artwork at MoMA, and we have a really good workflow. We have connection with TMS that pulls in the data to our DAM, and that works with really well, obviously, with artwork and exhibition assets. We basically have a fully automated workflow. Those go into TMS. After an approval process, they go to our website. They go to multiple places without us basically having to do much data entry at all. But at the museum, here's an exhibition image. This is really easy for us to tag. We use basically an exhibition ID, and it will pull in all the information about the exhibition. But MoMA is getting a larger and larger amount of images that are related to events that go on at the museum. Right now it's the 80th anniversary of our education department, so they are doing a ton of events. We also have a large media and performance department, and those performances often are related to exhibitions or to objects in the collection, but they are not considered basically an exhibition, so they don't get exhibition IDs. They'll have talks that are related to this exhibition. So this is an example. This is a Rauschenberg talk that they gave in the gallery. So obviously it's part of that exhibition, but there is no information anywhere that we could easily pull. So I actually started to look at that. We have a very simple workflow from our different departments where they'll drop things into folders. They give me basically a text file, and that text file has basically the URL to the website for that information. So the first place I tried to go to get the information was from our digital media team. I said, why are we cutting and pasting this when we could obviously get it directly from them, pull it out of there directly? And I know some of you, or a lot of you, went to a talk with Shannon, who is our digital media head, about saying no. So I am one of the people he often says no to, and because of all their projects that they're doing, they were unable to do it at the time. So I kept looking, where could I get this information from? And that is where I started looking, and I work all the time with our TMS team. The TMS team was trying to use this new part of the thing called the events module. So they're using that, but they couldn't get buy-in from their people either. They're trying to put people to enter this information in. And so we started working together, and we thought if we can sort of use it for the dam, that we'll be able to also then be able to use it, sell it to people, because not only will it go in there, it will pull the data into the dam, but it will also allow them then to tie these event information into an exhibition record or an object record. So it will have much more relational data that we wouldn't necessarily have in our dam. So we've been able to do that and put those in. So we basically will be able to automate and pull in the data without having to put anything else. So here again is this is a Project 107, which was a exhibition, but it was an exhibition about a performance group, and they did multiple performances all over the thing. And there were 5 or 6 events, and they had no information anywhere except on our website, which may not last. So the idea was to then tie it into the record. So we can put these in individually. You can put all these, you can see there's constituents, you can put the dates, and it ties in all that information. And then it's super easy for us to pull those 4 or 5 fields in. But then there's also a large amount of information that they can store in here that wouldn't necessarily be useful for dam searching, but would be great in terms of the event. In later dates when someone goes back and finds it. And they weren't keeping any kind of records of this information. And so it allows them to also do that and also create, even if we leave TMS, it would be able to, that data will still be there. And we've also now recently moved our archives over into TMS. So the same thing, they can also then, individually use these items to tag if they wanted to go down, and then so the record could have an individual museum archive record, an exhibition record. So all of that data basically will be in the record very easily, and it allows a person who actually knows what they're doing to catalog it versus my team, which is me, to do it in a long time. So that's the idea of that. And then we've also been able to, so I'll show you. So you can see it gets pulled in super easy. And basically, for this record, all of those fields that are there are coming in from 2 tags, an exhibition ID and a event ID, and that's it. And then all that information is in there. And if it gets updated, it would get updated in TMS, and we wouldn't have to worry about us having the wrong information. So it's relatively easy for us. And it then allows them also to have that material in there. So if someone uses TMS, we have users who sometimes are more TMS users. All of that information, all the thumbnails are in there. We can put press release. We've been putting press releases. We've been putting the contracts in there for the photographer and the performers. So those are also in 2 places. And then we also can link. There's also, so they took still images of this, but they also have video of this event. So they would then, there's a link in here that automatically opens to our DAM so that person doesn't have to log in. And we also have some tie-ins where we do, you can go to object package to TMS and vice versa, and some of that stuff will also work with this in relation. So the idea was not just to benefit us and get that data, but to think about it in the entire workflow, that you would be able to get that information in other places. And so also, again, when the people from the archives, if this then moves to records management and things like that, it's very easy to pull this out, and they'll have the information and the context, which you would probably lose doing that. And so the next step for us, too, is that we started using Jira as a workflow tool for our object and exhibition images. We use NetX, and they had created basically a tie-in so we can automatically upload those things so that someone can also tell me when they have these images ready without emailing me, getting rid of email, and then we can also track all of our statistics that way and really get an idea of what people are shooting throughout the museum and who they're hiring and are they overlapping and that kind of thing. And then we've also worked with, on the front end, to improve making sure that people are not sort of doing these incorrectly, is that we're also making sure that we've created guidelines for the museum across all of these different departments like marketing and education and graphics, all these departments who were hiring all these photographers from outside but weren't doing contracts, weren't consistently file naming, doing all that stuff. So actually doing that on the front end as well. You can have your photographers tag things and do file naming conventions. And so all of that in tandem with this has created a much easier workflow for us. Yep.
So we have a little bit of extra time for questions if anybody has any.
So thanks everyone. Just kind of question for the whole panel. I know a lot of these assets are internal assets, but I'm curious if any of these workflows or processes are impacting assets or documents or data that you share with outside institutions or exhibitions or anything like that.
I know for ours, one of the biggest for the interpretive labels is for people coming in for field trips. So that's where having the PDF of the actual labels themselves have been good to send out for creating the educators' packets, so that they were actually a main driver for getting all this information into TMS and accessible. So it's not, I mean, we've talked a bit about, kind of serving some of this on the web on our education pages, but for now it's just like case by case, but yeah.
for us, the one thing I didn't talk about, MoMA last summer did a huge.
the microphone.
Oh, sorry. MoMA did a huge exhibition history online that goes back to the very beginning, and basically all of the images, including the most recent exhibitions, all of those images and press releases are on there. And so we can do that for very easily in the same kind of workflow for all these performance and event things, along, you know, with the images and the video and things like that, to add to that, add depth to that collection that they're doing, history online, because that's a living, breathing thing that keeps going. So.
And I think for us, it's the same thing. I'm trying to eliminate lots of what are email chains right now, in part because everything went to this network drive. The only people who have access to that are the people in the marketing communications department. So even within the marketing communications department, the person who handles our outside PR isn't the person who shot the photography. So there's lots of emails back and forth about, like, did you A, photograph this thing? B, which of the Minds of Moria folders is that thing in? And can you recommend, like, of the 500 pictures you took of that event, which one should I use for this request? So again, hopefully when people now have access to this, some of that will be a little bit more straightforward.
BAMFA is also planning some exhibition history work. They'll eventually be on our public website, but it's much more rudimentary and in planning stages right now. And that's one of our big hurdles, is where the fuck do we get all these assets that are in network drives or not scanned yet or things like that. So yes, and.
Yeah.
At the moment, it's just being used with internal assets, but it is something that once we kind of do get the functionality a little more fleshed out, we do want to expand the use of, and it is something we would be using for those types of assets in the future, but not yet.
Thank you. Any other questions? Yeah.
So we're an organization that has a digital asset management solution. We don't have a full-time digital asset manager. So I'm jealous that your organizations have, recognized the need for that. But I'm interested in any advice or thoughts besides hire a full-time digital asset manager who's going to help manage a digital asset management solution and program without that full-time resource. Somebody sits in IT that wears one of many hats that is a digital asset manager. We have a committee that meets regularly to help sort of push those initiatives throughout the organization. But I'm looking for other thoughts or advice that you might have.
I can take that quickly. You have to have somebody own it. Even if you don't have a dedicated position as a digital asset systems manager or digital asset manager, you can have a small team of people that meet on a regular basis, but if you don't have someone who owns it and someone who's responsible, it won't work, because it will constantly be pushed off for other things that are considered a requirement or a job duty or a priority. It has to become a priority. And you don't get standards and you don't get workflows and you don't get uniformity unless you have somebody who owns it. So even if it's not necessarily a dedicated position, it has to be, 20 or 30% of this person's position or 20% of two people's position in order to split the workflow. But someone has to own it, and I don't think it's controversial for me to say it can't be IT. But it can't. There's a lot of really great skills that IT people have, but it's not necessarily around data. You need them for your storage, and you need them for the infrastructure, and you need them for the network connectivity, and you need them maybe to help with an API connection or something to create a link between your collections management system and your asset management system. But data and organization of assets and use and rights and permissions and all of the things that have to go around digital assets is not a skill of a dedicated IT department. So if anybody else wants to add to that. Is that helpful?
Yeah.
Okay. Yes.
Those of you who are linking your dams into your collections information databases and using that collections database to pull information about exhibitions and events and things, how are you managing those events in particular that fall outside of anything that's particularly object related? So if you've got automated workflows in place for the one aspect, there are going to be things that don't fall into that. So how are you addressing that?
Yeah, so you actually don't necessarily, it's a whole separate basically module in TMS, so it can be a standalone event very easily, which is part of the reason we were looking at it, because there are a large number that are not necessarily, but I also did want that relationship to be able to set up, because there are so many instances, especially in the museum world, that usually those events are tied in. But yes, you can put them in that way.
In the past, the way that I used to handle that, if it was something that didn't necessarily exist as a data set that came or was delivered from something else, using, I guess at my last institution, we were using Piction, and what I would create is an object record, because in the digital asset management system and using the standard metadata fields that existed around that record, I could relate digital assets to that record that would then inherit the information from that object record as soon as you related it to it, so that you only had to put that information in once, and it was standardized with any other of the digital assets that were related to that object record. So object records are usually a TMS pullover or a collections management system pullover, but you can use it for something like events, or you can use it for something outside of it, so that you can make sure that the 5 metadata fields that are related to that specific event are entered exactly the same way, so that they're searchable for anything that gets related to that record itself. Anyone else?
I mean, we're still in the early stages of this, but for things that are objects that are related, we use MIMSI, so the exhibition information is coming over. One of the other things we're doing in our Piction implementation is starting a new request form for the marketing and non-collection event stuff. We're going to try to share some of the load, and that form is going to have the ability for people who are making the request to enter information about the event that will then get attached to all the images that get loaded, including, like, if there's a calendar item on the website, I can put the URL there so I can go back to reference that event information.
Any other questions?
One issue with we have a lot of event, we have a lot of event images with minimal metadata.
Yeah.
And you might search on like an event name or a family day or a date range, but you'll get a lot of hits. Has anybody thought of ways of, you almost need a picture editor to sort through the results? Has anybody thought of ways of getting the best content to rise to the top?
I'll address it quickly, and I'll let you guys talk about it. The way that I've always done it is with rankings or priority in a metadata field. Whenever there is a event where you end up with 500 images of it, that there is an editor that goes through it beforehand and picks the top 20, and that those are labeled as primary or something like that, so that you doesn't necessarily have to be an advanced search, but that there's a way for those priority items to display over necessarily showing all 500 of those assets. And it depends on, I've always done it sort of through user roles. I don't believe that everybody in the museum necessarily needs to see all 500 of those. Sometimes they do, but most of the time they don't. Usually when those 500 assets are loaded, there are the 20 or 25 or 30 that are marked priority, and then those are the ones that show up when people search, because they don't need the 500. If they are still looking for something extra, then that's when they contact the digital asset manager or somebody else who loaded them, and you can then make additional assets available if they necessarily need them, but for the most part, they don't need the 500 to go through.
Can I ask a follow-up question?
Yeah.
So I think we're looking at that too, but we've already sort of had the conversation of like, well, your 5 isn't my 5.
Right.
So how do you have like definitions of that rating system? I think one of the things that I've started doing is looking at how some of the stock photography sites deal with it, about like, oh, this is a hero image, or even some of the composition stuff. but I'm curious about how you found consensus and agreement on a rating system.
There's never consensus and agreement. Sometimes you just have to do it. And that's why I said you're always going to get the extra question. Somebody's always going to come back and say, what else is there? And then you have the ability as the system manager, the asset manager, to get a little more information about what they're looking for. And then you can make some more things available. But there's never consensus because everybody always thinks you're hiding something from them. Yes.
Have people built in metadata that drills into the content of the images in a way that would allow you to do a search for, well, I need pictures of kids, or I need pictures showing diversity, and how have you done that?
Somebody else want to address it? I'm happy to.
Go ahead.
We haven't done it yet, but this is part of this trying to use Bridge more and trying to apply some of the things that are already in the IPTC and the plus standards. I'll also say one of the things that we're struggling with is how do we represent the diverse audience that comes to the museum, and that's proving to be a little bit trickier. So it's also getting away of like, is it kids or children? But actually in IPTC, it's like an age range. So you can say, oh, I want people under 18, because that's often the thing is like, right, we need permission forms.
And you can't call it kids because kids could mean baby goats.
Yeah.
Right, well, that's a different problem. We don't have many goats around the Glass Museum, fortunately. So that's one way we're approaching it, but I'd be interested to hear how other people are handling it.
We are out of time, so happy to talk about anything else. But I do want to throw out, hopefully next year, we are currently, I'm looking at AWS image recognition as a layer to live over the top of our digital asset management system. And the image recognition will automatically tag digital assets with things like those types of generic terms that will add search capabilities around it. So hopefully I'll have something fantastic next year to show you. Thanks, everyone.